right, joining us, like I mentioned before at the top of the show, she's a global affairs and military correspondent over at Scripps News, my friend Maya Rodriguez. Maya, good to see you.
It's great to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, thank you for coming on the program. And I watch a lot of your segments as you post them on LinkedIn about everything that's happening on the international stage. And there's been a lot of news to get to. So I want to get to first at the beginning on the onset here, because I know Secretary of State Marco Rubio just recently went to Saudi Arabia. I believe he's still there, meeting with some Russian counterparts, talking about the war in Ukraine. And obviously, President Trump has campaigned on ending the war in 24 hours. It's been 3 weeks. The war is not over, but I know there's obviously been some diplomatic talks. Can you tell us a little bit about the aims of this trip, meeting with Russian counterparts, and really Ukraine not being invited to at least this portion of the negotiation table?
Well, yeah, like you mentioned, Secretary Rubio is still there. They are in Riyadh. He just met with his Russian counterpart. It's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov. And, one of the things that everyone's been noticing is that absent from all this, like you mentioned, is any representation from Ukraine. So the question is, what exactly did the Russians and the United States talk about as far as the details of this meeting? And we're still getting some information in. It's still kind of early, but there were a lot of reporters there. They had shouted questions at them at one point. Rubio did not respond. One of the things we did hear from Russian media, because they were also there, they heard from Lavrov. And one of the things Lavrov said that a non-starter at this point for Russia would be allowing any sort of European peacekeeping troops within Ukraine. He said that would not be something they would be in favor of under any kind of a treaty, which of course then begs the question, how would you enforce a treaty? Who would be the boots on the ground enforcing that Ukraine and Russia remain at peace?
Maya, it's been interesting to watch Secretary of State Rubio. Obviously, both of us are Latino and Latina, respectively. And it's been at least fun. And I say fun in the sense that seeing somebody on the stage that looks like us, represents us, but also speaks Spanish. And I know he recently did a trip to Latin America. It was the first time a Secretary of State actually went out to LATAM since, I believe, during the George W. Bush administration. So I want to ask you a little bit more about the way we are perceived right now on the international stage with Marco Rubio as Secretary of State. But what can you tell us about this trip that he went to LATAM and why the administration has made this region so paramount in terms of building relationships with Panama, with El Salvador, with Honduras, and the countries in the region, especially because the president ran on immigration and right. And everybody knows that the triangle countries are kind of at the center of migrants that come into this country. What can you tell us about Marco Rubio's trip over the last couple of weeks out there to LATAM?
It's interesting. And speaking to sources, they'll tell you traditionally in years past, the very first trip that a US Secretary of State would take would be to Canada. That was considered our closest ally, the most important relationship. They're our northern neighbor. They would go there first, and then they would go to other countries. This really shows a pivot by Rubio and by the State Department at this point to focus on the Americas, to focus on the Western Hemisphere. And of course, a lot of that, like you brought up, is rooted in immigration. So we look at Panama. There's been a lot of discussion about Panama. Two things there, the canal and a place called the Darien Gap. Now, the Darien Gap is a very dangerous section of Panama. It basically links Panama with Colombia, just to the south. And it's a very dense jungle. It's very dangerous. There's all kinds of outlaws, illegal operations going on in there, and just physically treacherous to cross. But it is the land route that most migrants take when they leave South America and head up towards the US southern border. So with Rubio going to Panama, he wanted to address that. What can we do at the Darien Gap to try to stem the flow of migration there and sort of create perhaps a choke point? I mean, right now it basically is a choke point because it is so difficult to get through that area. The second reason he was down in Panama is you've heard President Trump talk about the Panama Canal, how he feels US ships, vessels are being overcharged. He's also concerned about the fact that China controls ports on either end of the canal. This is a Hong Kong based company, but as you know, Hong Kong is under the purview of China and the central government in Beijing. So Rubio went there because President Trump had mentioned that he wanted the US to take back the canal. Now, remember, back in 1977, the US and Panama signed an agreement that said the US would eventually relinquish control of the canal back to Panama. Of course, we helped build the canal more than 120 years ago now. Now, the deal was that Panama would regain control of the canal in the year 2000. But the stipulation was that the canal would remain neutral. President Trump believes because of those two Hong Kong ports on either side of the canal, it is violated. Panama has violated that treaty. In his opinion, he believes the canal is no longer neutral. When you hear the Panamanian president talk, though, he'll say, listen, the canal belongs to Panama. It's going to remain in Panamanian control, and we control the canal, no one else. But President Trump does not appear to be convinced of that. So you had Secretary Rubio going to Panama to talk about these two major things, immigration and, of course, the Panama Canal. And by the way, 40% of all the vessel traffic to the United States, to U.S. ports, goes through the Panama Canal. So it is a huge economic engine.
You know, Maya, for people that are listening to this show or watching us on our YouTube or streaming on Freebie TV, I'm curious because you covered this so often. You've been covering this for so long. People parachute in on the news. And so they see a previous administration, no focus on LATAM, no focus on the Panama Canal, or at least there's no news stories about it. Then all of a sudden, Panama Canal gets dumped into our laps front and center as the Trump administration has come in. Is it am I oversimplifying that like the news cycle has kind of caught wind of the Trump foreign policy aims? Or is it kind of like what you just said? They're really focused on this hemisphere because there is a lot of trade that's impacted here. And there's some economic solves here that President Trump has focused on. What has been your read on it, covering the previous administration foreign policy aims and affairs versus right now?
You know, when you speak to sources who have dealt with Latin American issues for years, they'll say, you know, over the decades, you know, leaders in Latin America have come to us and said, oh, you guys just don't focus on us enough. The US does not place enough emphasis on Latin America, considering that we're in your backyard. And now my sources say, well, they're definitely going to get that focus. Now, whether it's positive or negative, we'll have to wait and see. But, you know, for years, leaders sort of bemoaned the fact that the US really sort of ignored South America and Central America and the Caribbean and really kind of put their focus in the Middle East because, you know, we had a war there, and Afghanistan because we had a war there. And now Ukraine and Russia because there was a war going on there. This pivot that we have seen, you know, again, stems back to President Trump's immigration promises on the campaign trail. So in a way, you have to have Latin America involved in this in order to get to some of the root causes of immigration and migration. So they are looking to put some deals in place, some pressure in place. You know, they're attempting to deport people from the United States back to their home countries. These countries have to take these people in. And so there is a little bit of a carrot and stick going on here. Like, we can do this the easy way, or maybe we can do this the hard way. But either way, you know, we want you, Latin America, to kind of come along with us in this plan that we have in the United States, whether it's attempting to get to the root causes of migration or simply returning people to their home countries in Central and South America and the Caribbean.
You know, it's so funny you mentioned immigration because it funnels into the next follow-up question, which is Secretary of State Kristi Noem and the story that you did about Guantanamo Bay, which is a prison that maybe a lot of people don't know much about, or maybe they've heard about it from A Few Good Men back in the Aaron Sorkin days. So I would love for you to first take us inside this story, because at the core of this, again, it seems like everything kind of funnels into immigration, which is what President Trump ran on. Kristi Noem has visited Guantanamo Bay because there is talks to potentially send folks that are either illegal or have come to this country but have committed crimes to Guantanamo Bay. What can you tell us about that story?
Yes, a little bit of history there. I think most people, when they hear Guantanamo, they think 9/11 terrorists. This is where we put the worst of the worst who were threatening America. We put them in this naval base that sits in a portion of Cuba that the United States has managed to hold on to, despite the fact that our relations with Cuba itself are quite frayed. We've managed to hold on to this naval base for all of these decades. So most people, when they think about Guantanamo, nicknamed Gitmo, they think about the 9/11 terrorists or other terrorists who have been sent there. But there's a history that predates that. And back in the 90s, between 1994 and 1996, there was a massive exodus from Cuba. You had Cuban refugees leaving by boat en masse. We are talking tens of thousands of people. And the US Coast Guard was intercepting them, but they needed a place to put them. And so what they did was they took them to Guantanamo, and a tent city was set up there. And there were so many thousands. I'm talking more than 30,000 Cuban refugees at Guantanamo, men, women, children. At one point, they even set up makeshift schools at this tent city because there were so many kids there. So there is some precedent for holding migrants at Guantanamo. Now, eventually, because of the politics of it, because of the special considerations that Cubans had for entering the US, they were eventually processed, and the majority of them did end up emigrating to the United States and settling in all sorts of areas, mainly in South Florida, though. So there is some precedent for holding migrants in Guantanamo. Granted, this was, 30 years ago now, so it really hasn't been held for that at this point. Now, you mentioned DHS Secretary, Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem did go down to Guantanamo because what they want to do now is to use the naval base as a holding place for people that they intend to deport from the United States. So almost the reverse of what happened 30 years ago, which was 30 years ago, they were holding people to process them so that they would eventually come to the United States. This would be the reverse. They would put people there, hold them, process them, and then send them back to their home countries. Now, what we've heard Noam say is that the people they are sending to Guantanamo are the worst of the worst. Lately we've seen several flights carrying maybe around 10 people each. So there might be 30 or so migrant detainees down there. Noam says these are members of a Venezuelan gang. It is not clear at this point if they actually are. We don't know anything about these people. We don't know their names. We just know that they were flown down there and that they are currently being held on the same side of the base that holds the terrorism suspects that I was talking about earlier related to the 9/11 attacks. So they're all being held on the same side of the base. But, the idea of potentially deporting tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands possibly, and holding them in Guantanamo, I mean, this is quite the setup they're going to have there. They're going to have to put up a massive tent city. I will say 30 years ago, when the Cubans were held at Guantanamo and it was under different circumstances, there was quite a lot of squalor. I was a cub reporter back then, and one of the stories that I did related to that was I was in high school, and eventually some of the kids from Guantanamo were allowed to come to the US, and they enrolled in my high school, some of the older kids who were teenagers. So I did profile some of them. And the conditions down there that they described were quite terrible. It'd be very rainy. They're in these tents. They would be leaking. There was mud everywhere. The mosquito situation was, out of control. It was not the most pleasant place. So they were quite grateful to now be in the United States. Think about the reverse now. I mean, what is this tent city going to look like? What will the conditions look like? I know there are several media outlets, including yours truly. I am trying to go to Guantanamo because we are curious about what this all looks like. We're curious about how they're going to be held. Where are they going to be held? How is all of this going to work? They really haven't exactly made that clear. And I think that's why we've seen just such low numbers at this point. This is pretty much, the numbers that they can currently handle at this point. But I will say this, there was a recent visit from the head of Southcom down there. And he went down to meet with the troops and, speak with some of the people from the naval base there and kind of get a lay of the land because they are preparing for this to happen, for these people to end up down there. So again, it remains to be seen exactly what that's going to look like.
A lot to watch there, and we'll be checking out for your stories on that. And you've done some great reporting, like I mentioned, not only in the past, but in recent about Kristi Noem's visit down there. I want to pivot. We've been talking about this hemisphere. Let's go to the other hemisphere that we were just talking about before, because Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth and also Vice President Vance at the Munich Security Conference and at NATO, respectively, giving different speeches and talking about the U.S.'s newfound position towards Europe. I want to play something for you that Secretary of Defense Hegseth said recently to NATO. So take a listen to this.
As the war approaches its third anniversary, our message is clear. The bloodshed must stop, and this war must end. We will only end this devastating war and establish a durable peace by coupling allied strength with a realistic assessment of the battlefield. We're also here today to directly and unambiguously express that stark strategic realities prevent the United States of America from being primarily focused on the security of Europe. The United States faces consequential threats to our homeland. We must and we are focusing on security of our own borders. The United States remains committed to the NATO alliance and to the defense partnership with Europe. Full stop.
All right. So he said a couple things there that are kind of counter of each other. One, that we're not as focused on the security of Europe, but then we are committed to NATO, full stop. This has kind of been something that has been covered recently because France and President Emmanuel Macron met with other European leaders to kind of discuss the US's new position and framing around the relationship with Europe, and almost as if they can't rely on the United States anymore. Am I reading that correctly, Maya? What's your take? Because we've been talking about the perception of the US now on the global stage, specifically when it comes to the relationship with Europe. Are you hearing something similar given these recent speeches by J.D. Vance and Pete Hegseth, or is it something different?
No, I think you're right there. And by the way, that summit that President Macron called was an emergency summit. This was not planned. So they see this as an emergency. Now, there is a tension there that you kind of alluded to, right? We are committed to NATO, but we cannot focus on Europe. There is a little bit of back to the immigration situation. You heard Hegseth there refer to securing the borders. So how are they doing that? They're going to need military. They've already sent thousands of troops to the border, American troops, to try to secure the southern border. So they are definitely going to need manpower and personnel to focus on that if that is their plan. Well, where is all this manpower going to come from? I mean, something has to give. And what it sounds like is that it's going to give a little bit in Europe. Now, I'm not saying troops based in Europe are suddenly going to be on the southern border, but there's certainly going to be a scrutiny on how the US deploys its military resources around the world. And because the Trump administration seems to be looking more inwardly into America, how are we secure here within our own borders? That means less focus on our European allies. And of course, the Europeans, today, you were just hearing on the BBC, I mean, they are, to put it mildly, really concerned about this, and that they don't feel like they can really rely on the United States anymore for their security. So what does that mean? Well, it means they're going to have to spend a lot more on their military. Now, one of the things that President Trump has said repeatedly is that he does not feel enough members of NATO give enough of a percentage of their gross domestic product, their GDP, towards the military. There's about 2/3 of the NATO countries that give 2% or more. He wants it to be 4%. Now, I want to stop there and say no one puts 4% of their GDP into military. No members of NATO, that is, not even the United States. The country that actually comes closest to that is Poland. They do more than 3%, but nobody else even comes close to 4%. But that's been one of the beefs, if you will, that Trump has had with our European allies, is that they don't spend enough on their own military. And he feels like America shoulders more of the burden. So now you have the Europeans saying, well, if we can't necessarily rely on American military might to keep us secure, to keep our border secure, and they're keeping an eye on Ukraine and they see what Russia did in Ukraine, what can they do in turn? Do they need to create another alliance, sort of a Europe-based alliance that would also include Great Britain and the EU countries, and even some of the countries that are not in the EU but are in Europe, and create some kind of European military alliance or pact? Now, this is just in the talking stages at this point, but it just goes to show how alarmed the European allies are at this point that they are even talking about that. Because for so long, it was, NATO. And we just celebrated, if you will, the 75th anniversary of NATO here in DC. I was at that conference. It was just a few blocks from our bureau, actually. And you had world leaders there. This was before the election, though. And at this point, President Biden had not dropped out of running. So things have changed quite a bit since that 75th anniversary, because a lot of people were saying the NATO alliance is strong, it will never be defeated. This is why, it was founded so many years ago. And look, all of the things that it has seen come and go in the last 75 years, and the alliance remains strong. All of that has now really been called into question, especially with these sort of unilateral negotiations we're seeing between the US and Russia over the war in Ukraine, which the European allies say they should be involved too in those negotiations. Ukraine should be involved, they say, and we should be involved as well, because again, this is all happening right on the borders of Europe.
A lot to watch for there. Maya, before I let you go, you've done some great reporting on these prisoner exchanges and swaps, specifically recently, President Trump securing the exchange of Mark Fogel coming back to the U.S. I would love for you to tell us a little bit about not only his story, but kind of the way these have unfolded over the past since you've been covering them.
Yeah, and in fact, there was another man, Caleb Bagers. He was just released a couple of days ago from Russia. This is just following up on Mark Fogel, who was released last week from Russia. He's a Pennsylvania teacher who was held in Russia for a couple of years. He was in prison. He was caught at the airport in Russia. He's a teacher who had been teaching in Moscow at the time, was going through the airport there, and he had medical marijuana on him, which is not legal in Russia. He was arrested. He was put in prison. A 14-year sentence is what he was serving. Now, the United States says that this exchange that they got out of Russia, Mark Fogel specifically, was one that the Russians put forward as a show of good faith. That is the quote from the National Security Advisor. This was a show of good faith by the Russians. And how that plays into all of this, including the recent release of another American, really goes to show, is it the carrot and the stick, or is it more just carrot? Do the Russians know, that they want to sweeten things up before they go into these tough negotiations, if they are even tough? I mean, we don't really know what's going on in these negotiations between the United States and Russia at this point. They're trying to kind of sweeten the deal a little bit. So I'm not surprised that these two Russians were released. We did, however, I should point out, have some releases of Americans held by Russia under the Biden administration without this sort of Ukrainian backdrop, if you will. I don't know if you recall, but last summer, there was a major prisoner exchange that involved multiple countries, including the US, which eventually led to the release of 3 US citizens, including Wall Street Journal reporter Evan Gershkovich and retired US Marine Paul Whelan. And, the Biden administration managed to do this very complicated exchange, and it did require, Germany to be involved, and they had to release a Russian criminal who had assassinated a Chechen in Berlin and had been convicted of that. There were all these countries involved to get these people released. But what wasn't involved in all this? Ukraine. Now, though, we have this specter of the war in Ukraine sort of hanging over these particular releases of Americans from Russia. Do they play in directly to that? That's not really clear at this point, but the timing is certainly interesting.
Certainly interesting. Is something to watch. Maya Rodriguez, you do fantastic work. You can check out all of her articles or pieces that she's done over on scripsnews.com. I can't thank you enough for hopping on the program and giving us some time. Continue success to you, and please stay safe.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.